Welcome. This is Evil, a horror fiction podcast. I am your narrator and producer, Dennis Sarah. Evil Podcast can be found on almost any podcast player, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. You can do us a great favor and hit subscribe on whatever podcast player you use. Also, if you can rate and review, I would sure appreciate it. You can find past episodes of Evil Podcast at evilpodcast.com. At the website, you can also get t-shirts, become a Patreon, or simply hit the donate button and help us keep the lights on here at Evil Podcast. As Evil Podcast is your monthly audio horror magazine, this month is no different. We have two great stories for you. Our first story is PUFFALUMP by Donald Glass. Our second story, If a Ghost Comes Knocking by Steve Carr. Evil Podcast is also taking submissions for future episodes. If you've got a horror story between 1,500 and 4,500 words, go ahead and email it to me at mrdennisser@yahoo.com, or simply go through the website evilpodcast.com and email me through there. If you're ever curious about the evolution of Evil Podcast and what the early episodes sounded like, those are on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you become a Patreon of Evil Podcast and get access to those 15 episodes. They contain stories from history, as well as stories I wrote myself. Other ways to contact me, you can go on Twitter at Dennis Sarah, or on Facebook, we have a new group. Go to facebook.com/group/evilpodcast. With all that said, let's get to our stories. I first came across this story at Horrorzine, an online horror magazine. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can see that for yourselves. It's a great magazine. Donald Glass lives in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He writes mostly about the underside of life that dwells in every city, including yours and mine. He's had work published in all the usual places online, including Shotgun Honey, Spelk, Dead Guns Press, Yellow Mama, Near to the Knuckle, Out of the Gutter, and Thrill Kills and Chaos. He's also had 3 stories published in print in the Dead Guns Press anthologies: Hardboiled, Crime Scene, Dames in Sin. So this is PUFFALUMP by Donald Glass. Dimming toward twilight, the sun slipped over the horizon. Soon it would disappear. The heat of the midsummer's day would dissipate and lower the temperature to a comfortable degree. Until then, it would be as if it had been all day, hot and humid. Bobby followed his big sister, stumbling occasionally on the rocky ground. Dry grass brushed against his bare legs, and the occasional bug lighted in his face. He hated bugs, and would have turned back if not for the balloons. They shouldn't be up here near the woods. His mother had told him many times not to go into the woods. He could get lost. But Becky wanted him to go on an adventure with her, to find balloons. He'd never been on an adventure before, so he followed her. With sweat dripping into his eyes and gnats swarming his face, he was having second thoughts. Gnats were bugs, and bugs were insects. And insects were kind of like spiders. He was terrified of spiders. "We shouldn't be up here, Becky." "Be quiet, don't be a baby." "I'm not a baby," he said, voice quavering. "You're acting like one." "Come on, it's not much further," she said, leading the way. Bobby wasn't a baby in any way, except mentally. He looked like a perfectly normal 8-year-old. Suffering a blow to his head as an infant had left him mentally challenged and living in a world of a 4-year-old, a world he could never grow out of. He took the deep breath his mother had told him to take when he got upset, and followed his sister across the field into the woods. He wanted to find the balloons that his mother had gotten for him. She told him to be careful with them, and he lost them. He didn't want her to be angry with him. "Where are we going, Becky?" "We're going to get your balloons, and I have a surprise for you. You'll like it." "Is it ice cream?" "Ice cream would be a good surprise." "Yeah, there will be lots of ice cream. Follow me," she said, and ducked down the path leading into the woods. "I saw the balloons float away up here." At age 15, Becky resented him even more than she did when she hit him on the head all those years ago. She'd been the firstborn, and spoiled rotten until Bobby came along. Her world suddenly changed, and it became the baby's world, Bobby's world, always Bobby. The attention he received finally overwhelmed her. 2 days after his first birthday, an extravagant affair that dwarfed her previous birthday, she took matters into her own hands. While he slept in the crib, she stood over him, watching him sleep. Judging where the soft spot on his head might be, feeling the weight of Bobby's building block in her hand, she decided it was time to eliminate her competition. The following day, he seemed fine. She'd failed. But as time progressed, Bobby's development slowed and eventually stopped. At the age of 4, he began suffering seizures and required almost constant watch. The job fell on Becky to watch over him when her parents couldn't, another insult taking even more of her time. The act she desperately attempted had backfired, leaving her brother not gone but even more reliant on his parents and her to survive. Becky's world grew smaller, while Bobby's inflated. He became the center of their universe, a universe full of medication, doctor's visits, and specialized equipment he needed on a daily basis. "Come on, Bobby, you don't want the Puffalump to get you," she said in a sing-song voice as she led him in the woods. Moving faster than he could, she quickly outdistanced him. The trees blocked out almost all what little light remained. Streaks of sun broke through the dense forest, casting blades of light in random patterns, like knives stabbing into the earth. Bobby froze in his tracks. A mere 15 feet inside the darkness, he felt like it was another world. Bobby was afraid of the dark. The dark belonged to the Puffalump and the spiders. Puffalump had been his favorite toy, fluffy and soft. He'd carried it everywhere and used it for a pillow when he took his naps. Until the day Becky showed him the secret of the Puffalump. She called him over to the porch and showed him something hanging under the steps. It was a white, egg-shaped sphere, wrapped in silky thread. It hung suspended in a corner under the porch steps. Gently, she reached out a finger and touched it, telling him it was the baby Puffalump. It would grow and be just like his someday. "Pretty," he said as he stroked its silky exterior. "Watch this." She picked up a stick and poked it until it burst open. Hundreds of baby spiders spilled onto the ground. They crawled frantically in all directions. Bobby screamed and ran. That night he had a nightmare and slept with his parents. The next day, still not wanting to believe his sister, he pulled at the stitching of the Puffalump. His awkward fingers worked the threads for hours until it came loose. He pulled the seam apart. Inside the Puffalump, he saw soft, silky white stuffing. It looked just like what was underneath the porch. Screaming, he begged his mother to throw the Puffalump away. Nightmares of the Puffalump became a regular occurrence, usually followed by a fit or a tantrum. In his dreams, the toy became an evil creature. It stalked him in the darkness, dragging him away to a horrible place of blackness, a hole from which he knew, even in his slow mind, there was no escaping. He always woke screaming and covered in sweat. Now standing in the dimness of the woods, he imagined it was the place that the Puffalump lived. The mention of the Puffalump combined with the surrounding darkness froze his blood. He stood in the woods his mother had told him never to go into, thinking of nothing but the Puffalump and spiders. "Becky," he whispered, terrified. As soon as she outdistanced him, she slowed and silently crept deeper toward the spot she had recently discovered, the old well shaft. Dusk's flickering light combined with the gentle swaying of the tree branches, causing the darkness to seemingly dance at the edge of his vision. He gripped the words his mother had said to him often when he was frightened. "It's all in your head," he whispered, repeating his mother's words, eyes flickering left and right. Suddenly, ahead of him, his sister appeared. "Run, Billy! The Puffalump is behind you! He's going to get you and cover you with spiders!" Without turning to look, Billy ran towards the safety of his big sister. His squat legs carried him awkwardly across the uneven ground. All he could see was his sister and safety. For all meanness she displayed toward him, she was still his sister, and he loved and trusted her. The creeping shadows now seemed to narrow, threatening to cut off his path to her. Something moving caught the edge of his vision, something darker than the shadows. Beetles, bugs, and spiders. A specter of insects rippled across the foliage like waves of dark water. All in my head. Only a few feet from running into the safety of Becky's arms, he tripped and fell. He hit the ground hard, his head striking a rock with a sickening crack. Annoyed at his clumsiness, Becky walked over to him and used her foot to nudge his arm. Nothing. Again, she struck him with her foot, harder this time. Still no movement. She looked from his still body to the well. It was maybe 20 feet away. She would have to drag him, and then she would have to cover up the trail. It needed to look like an accident. She rolled him over and saw the gash on his forehead. A twisted path of flesh opened from his hairline to his right unblinking eye. She glanced at his left eye. It was open also and completely black, as if the pupil had expanded to fill the orb. Then she noticed the wound on his head had no blood in it. The cracking of the skull had been loud enough to make her cringe. There should be some blood. She picked up a stick and gingerly poked the outer edge of the bloodless cut. His body twitched, causing her to jump. She poked the stick into the wound. Stringy white fluid oozed out and moved across his face and neck, as with a mind of its own. Tendrils of viscous fluid wrapped itself around his head and neck. She screamed and stood up too fast. Losing her footing, she stumbled backwards and fell. Bobby's shrouded head swelled and pulsated, over and again until it tore open. Thousands of spiders pushed their way through the opening and spilled onto the ground. The leafy underbrush became black as they swarmed towards her. Feet and hands thrusting against the leafy underbrush, she pushed herself further away from her brother. Wildly, she propelled herself backward as the spiders converged upon her legs, biting the flesh. Within seconds, she was covered in spiders. She tried to scream, but barely made a sound as they filled her mouth and swarmed down her throat. Bobby woke to the sound of his mother's voice, sounding far off and dreamy. His eyes focused on the stars just coming out. He sat up and saw his balloons floating above him. His mother sprinted to him. "Bobby, are you all right? You know you're not supposed to wander out the yard." She hugged him, nearly crushing him in her embrace. "I was getting my balloons. They floated away. The Puffalump found them for me," he said, shaking his arm with the balloons tied to it and making them dance in the air. Now, Bobby, what did we tell you about the Puffalump? She asked gently. He's not real. No, he's not. He's just something your sister uses to try to scare you. He's all in your head. All in my head, he repeated, and gently touched the faint scar on his forehead, already fading away. She took his hand in hers and began leading him back to the house. Your sister was supposed to be watching you. Have you seen her? No, he said softly, and glanced over his shoulder towards the woods. I don't know where she is anymore. And that was The Puffalump by Donald Glass. I'll have Donald's information in the show notes. Be sure to look him up. Our next story is If a Ghost Comes Knocking by Steve Carr. Steve, who lives in Richmond, Virginia, began his writing career as a military journalist and has had over 100 short stories published internationally in print and online magazines, literary journals, and anthologies. His plays have been produced in several states. He was a 2017 Pushcart Prize nominee. You can find him on Twitter at CarrSteven960. I'll put a link to both his Twitter and his Facebook page in the show notes. So without further ado, If a Ghost Comes Knocking by Steve Carr. In the middle of the night, Chloe's piercing cry awakened her mother. Jennifer tossed aside her covers and flipped on the lamp on the bedside stand and sat up on the edge of the bed. What is it? Luke mumbled, with his eyes still closed and not moving from his curried position on the side of the bed. Can't you hear her? Jennifer said. Chloe's had another bad dream. They're called nightmares, he said. Whatever they're called, she's had another one, Jennifer said as she stood up and brushed her long brown hair back from her face with her fingers. Leaving the bedroom, she walked into the hallway that was lit only by a nightlight plugged into an outlet low on the wall above the baseboard. It flickered as she passed and then went out when she entered Chloe's bedroom. The glow of a low-voltage bulb in a lamp, with a shade decorated with dancing lambs, was cast over the bed. Jennifer went to the bed and pulled the blanket down that Chloe had pulled over her head. She was curled into a fetal position and crying. Mommy's here, Jennifer said as she gently placed her hand on the girl's back. Did you have another bad dream? No, Mommy, she said, her voice quivering. It was at the window again. The shining man was at the window? Jennifer said, putting her hand in Chloe's golden blonde hair. Chloe rolled onto her back. Tears streaked her pink cheeks. Yes, Mommy. He kept tapping on it. Jennifer glanced at the window. The curtains were spread and the night sky was freckled with glimmering white stars. She wiped away the girl's tears with the tips of her fingers, then bent down and kissed her on the forehead. He's gone now, sweetheart, she said. I'll close the curtain so that he knows to stay away. Okay, Mommy, Chloe said. Jennifer went to the window and looked down at the park across the street from their high-rise. Lampposts showed their light on the path nearest the street. The trees in the park were lost in the blackness. She was about to pull the curtain closed, then noticed a handprint on the other side of the glass. Her heart began to beat hard. She quickly pulled the curtains closed, and then returned to sitting on Chloe's bed. You can sleep now and forget all about the man, she said. Chloe yawned. I don't like him, Mommy. I don't blame you, sweetie, Jennifer said. Go back to sleep and dream about kittens. You like them. Chloe shut her bright blue eyes. I like kittens, she said as she began to drift off to sleep. Jennifer kissed her on the cheek, then stood up and went to the door. She glanced at the window. and felt a chill go up her spine. Bright morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Jennifer stood at the sink with her hands immersed in soapy water, using a sponge to wash the pan she had used to fix breakfast. Chloe was sitting behind her at the kitchen table, trying to feed her doll, Frida, a spoonful of raspberry jam. Luke came into the kitchen wearing his bright blue Gatsby cap. He kissed Chloe on the top of the head, then leaned against the sink watching Jennifer. "Russ Viberg is a big client and he wanted to discuss his account." Jennifer turned on the faucet and ran the pan under hot water. "Why am I just hearing about this? And when am I going to meet this important client of yours?" "Russ is the all-business type. You wouldn't like him very much, even if he consented to meeting you socially, which he never would," he stammered. "About the money, I simply forgot to tell you." He put his hand on her shoulder. She shrugged his hand off and put the pan in the dish drainer. "You seem to be forgetting to tell me a lot of things recently, like where you got the money to make that large deposit you made into our account." Luke pushed back the cap on his head. "It was a return on investment," he said. "What investment?" she said, eyeing him suspiciously. He looked at the gold watch on his tanned wrist and said, "We can discuss it later, but I need to go. Russ Viberg is a stickler about punctuality." He hurriedly kissed her on the cheek and then rubbed his hand across Chloe's cheek before leaving the kitchen. A few moments later, Jennifer heard the front door open and close. She turned and leaned back against the sink and watched Chloe with Frida. Red juice from the jam was running down the doll's chin and onto the doll's pale green gingham dress. That the jam resembled a little too closely that of blood made her uncomfortable. "What would you like to do today, Chloe?" she said. "Go to the park," Chloe said enthusiastically. "Then the park it is," Jennifer said. She wiped Frida's face with a sponge and placed the doll in a sitting position in a chair, and took her daughter's hand and walked with her out of the kitchen. In Chloe's bedroom, Jennifer helped her change into play clothes and lace up her sneakers. She repeatedly glanced at the closed curtains until she decided she was being foolish. And leaving Chloe sitting in front of the girl's vanity dresser, she went to the window and slowly opened the curtains. On the outside of the glass, the words, "You owe me," was scrawled by a fingertip across the pane. Jennifer let out a short gasp and quickly pulled the curtains closed. "What's wrong, Mommy?" Chloe said. "Nothing, sweetheart," Jennifer said, taking the girl's hand and leading her out of the bedroom. As she opened the front door, on the outside hallway floor, Frida was lying on her back, with a fork stuck in the middle of her forehead. In the shade of a large maple tree, Jennifer sat on a bench on the edge of the park's small playground, while Chloe played in the sandbox with two other children. Chloe was holding Frida in one hand, while she built walls of a castle using a plastic drinking cup using the other hand. The Band-Aid placed across the doll's forehead had calmed the girl's distress of having seen the fork stuck in it. It also brought an end to the number of questions that Jennifer couldn't answer that Chloe had about how the doll got in the hallway and who was to blame for its injury. Afraid to take her eyes off her daughter, Jennifer shut out the sounds and movements of other parents and children nearby. When her cell phone buzzed, it momentarily startled her. She took it out of her jeans pocket and looked at the text. "In your window," it said. The number it was being sent from was her business cell phone that she had left in the apartment. She stood up and walked around the tree and looked up at the window 12 stories up. Though hard to discern the details of what she was seeing, it was clearly a man standing in the window. She received another text. "Pay your debt," it said. Then the phone disconnected. Jennifer jammed her phone into her pocket and ran back around the tree. Chloe was gone. "Chloe?" she shrieked. "What, Mommy?" Chloe said as she tugged on her mother's back pocket. Jennifer whirled around, nearly knocking her daughter down. and scooping her into her arms and ran out to the park across the street and into the apartment building. Eddie, the concierge, was sitting at the lobby desk reading a newspaper. "Someone got into our apartment," she said as the elevator arrived and the door opened. Eddie scratched his head. "You were outside. How would you know?" he said dubiously. She ran into the elevator and hit the button for the 12th floor. As the door closed, she put Chloe down and leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. 6 floors up, the elevator suddenly stopped, and the light went out, making it pitch black. "Mommy!" Chloe screamed. Jennifer reached out and felt her daughter's hair, and then grabbed her arm. "I'm right here, sweetheart." "Frina! It took Frina!" Chloe squealed. The light came back on and the elevator shook, then began to move again. Jennifer looked around the elevator. The doll was gone. Jennifer hugged her daughter to her until they reached their floor. When the door opened, Jennifer pulled Chloe along as she ran to the apartment and put the key in the door and opened it. It was quiet. She closed and locked the door and ran down the hallway to her bedroom. It had been ransacked. "Why just our bedroom?" Jennifer said to Luke, who was hanging his suits back on their hangers. "I have no idea," he said. "At least nothing is missing. I have some expensive jewelry. Why wasn't any of that taken?" she said. "I'd feel better if something had been taken." She righted the last overturned bottle of perfume that sat on her vanity dresser. "The police didn't even believe me when I told them I had seen someone in our window and about the text I received." "I guess it would have been hard to believe since you couldn't show them the text," he said as he sat on the edge of the bed. "I got that text, God damn it," she said. "I can't explain why it had disappeared from the phones, but I got it." He raised his hands as if surrendering. "I believe you." "That's twice. That whoever is doing this, and that they have said something about something being paid back," she said as she sat on the stool in front of the dresser. "Twice?" he said. She told him about the scrawling on Chloe's bedroom window. "I'm glad you didn't tell the police about that," he said. "They would have hauled you off to the loony bin." He plopped onto his back. "You just need to be sure to lock the front door when you go out." Through clenched teeth, Jennifer said, "The front door was locked." Chloe appeared in the doorway with her arms full of stuffed animals and dolls. "They're scared and they want to hide," she said. Jennifer got up and started to walk around towards Chloe, when a glowing apparition of a man appeared behind her daughter in the hallway. Its mouth curved into a malevolent grin, its dull yellow eyes fixed on hers for a moment, and then it darted off down the hall. "Luke!" Jennifer screamed. "It's in here with us." She grabbed Chloe and quickly pulled her into the bedroom, causing her to drop her toys. Luke sat up. "What's in here?" "That man! Ghost! It ran down the hall toward the kitchen," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. Chloe began to cry. Luke got off his bed. "I'll take a look." He walked out of the bedroom and out into the hallway and turned toward the kitchen. He returned a few minutes later. "I went all through the apartment. There's no one here but us." It was here, standing right behind Chloe," she said. "It was hideous." Luke picked up Chloe and hugged her to him. "Hideous how?" "Its smile was grotesque. I've never seen such malice in a face," she said. "I think it means to harm us." Luke stared at her for a moment and then burst out laughing. "You're kidding, right?" he said. "How can a ghost hurt us?" Jennifer stared at him, dumbfounded. "With what's been going on, how can you even ask that?" she said, then stormed out of the bedroom. While Chloe slept, Jennifer sat in a chair at the window in her daughter's bedroom, staring out at the city skyline, the night sky, and the park. She pulled her hand-knitted shawl around her shoulders and tried to still the rapid beating of her heart. On one hand, she wanted the apparition to appear at the window to prove to herself that she hadn't lost her mind. But on the other hand, the idea of seeing it frightened her. The sudden movement on the path in the park immediately drew her attention. The ghost was floating a few feet off the ground and juggling a couple of objects she couldn't make out. It suddenly stretched out his hand and pointed at the window, at her. Then it suddenly vanished. There was a knock at the front door of the apartment. Jennifer got up and cautiously walked out into the hallway. She stood still for a minute, listening. She turned on the hallway light and went to the door. "Who's there?" she said. Getting no reply, she peeked through the peephole and saw no one. Putting her hand on the doorknob, she hesitated for a moment, and then opened the door. On the floor lay Luke's cap and Frida without her head. She picked them up and shut and locked the door and ran down the hallway into the bedroom. She flipped on the light. Luke rolled onto his back and mumbled drowsily, "What's going on?" "That's what I'd like to know," Jennifer said as she flung his cap on the bed. He picked up the cap and turned it over several times. "Where did you get this?" "It was left at the door by the ghost," she said. Luke nervously twisted the cap in his hands. "It's a sign that the ghost wants the money back I stole from him when he was alive," he said. "It was money that was supposed to go to his family, but no one knew about it but me and him. I've tried to reason with him." "You've known about the ghost and you tried to reason with it?" she said shrilly. "The ghost is," he began. "I don't care who it is," she screamed at him. "You must give the money back." "I'm not going to do that," he said. "No one knows about the money except you and I." "And the ghost," she said. Chloe's scream was abrupt, but loud. Then there was silence. Jennifer ran from her bedroom to Chloe's bedroom. The child's bed was empty. The words, "Repaid in full," was scribbled on the window. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Evil Podcast. Again, if you'd like to help out Evil Podcast, go and hit subscribe on whatever podcast player you use. If you can, rate and review us and tell others about us. Evil Podcast can also use your help to keep the lights on. If you'd like to donate any amount of money, you can go to evilpodcast.com and hit the donate button. Or if you'd like to become a Patreon and donate as little as $1 a month, you'll have access to the 15 first-year episodes of Evil Podcast. Again, most of those written by me. Again, thank you for listening to Evil Podcast, your monthly horror audio magazine. Until we meet again, be good. Evil Podcast is copyrighted by Dennis Sarah. The respected stories that appeared in this episode are copyrighted by the respected authors. Music was provided by Kevin MacLeod.